I still remember the weight of my husband David's brass larkbarks, buried beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of our root cellar with a warning in red ink: "Do not trust them. Save yourself." The metal was cold and heavy in my hands, the clasp stubborn, and when I finally pried it open and read the words he had left me 3 years before he died, I didn't believe them completely, not yet. But over the next 5 years, I watched my stepson forge my signature onto a promissory note for $300,000, liquidate every asset our farm-to-table restaurant had ever built, and leave me with a mountain of debt and a farmhouse full of ghosts. I methodically dismantled his entire fraudulent empire with a forensic audit that spanned thousands of pages, bought the restaurant's own forged debt at a distressed loan auction for $18,000, forced a bankruptcy sale, and repurchased the business. Now, that boy is a disbarred felon, and I am back in the kitchen slicing heirloom tomatoes from the same seeds David and I planted together. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that justice can be served with a forensic accountant and a quiet, stubborn refusal to be erased. I need to take you back to the soil, because you can't understand the depth of the betrayal unless you understand the decades of sweat that made that restaurant something worth stealing. I married David when I was 31, and I was already a farmer. I had a degree in horticulture from the State University, where I specialized in soil microbiology and integrated pest management, but my real education came from my father, Harold, who was a maintenance supervisor at a state correctional facility. He was a quiet man with thick, capable hands, the kind of hands that could rebuild a hydraulic pump or thread a needle with equal precision, and he believed that a woman should never be locked out of her own life. When I was 12, he sat me down at the workbench in our garage under a single bare bulb and handed me a basic pin tumbler lark mounted on a wooden block. He said, "Laura, most of the world's larks are just puzzles. Learn the puzzle and you'll always have a key." Over the next few years, he taught me how to service old larks, how to rekey a deadbolt, how to repair a broken keyway, and eventually how to pick a standard 5-pin lark with a hook and a tension wrench. I learned to feel the subtle spring pressure of each pin, the faint click of a shear line setting, the difference between a set pin and one that was just sticky with grime. He gave me a small canvas tool roll, the kind tradesmen use for drill bits, and I filled it with picks of various profiles, a plug spinner and a few modified wrenches. I kept it in my gardening kit, labeled as my herb pruning kit, and no one ever questioned it. That skill set, born from a father's practical love, would become one of the sharpest tools in my arsenal decades later, in a house that was never my home. David was 10 years older than me, a big, broad-shouldered man with a laugh that could fill a barn and hands that could gentle a spooked horse. When I met him at a regional farmer's market, he was running a small roadside vegetable stand on a rented acre in the Hudson Valley, selling the best sweet corn I had ever tasted and telling customers about his dream of a true farm-to-table restaurant, where every ingredient on the plate came from the soil we tended, where the menu changed with the seasons, and where guests could walk through the fields and see their dinner growing. That was in the early 2000s, before the phrase farm-to-table became a marketing sticker on a plastic-wrapped supermarket tomato. We married in the orchard of a friend's farm, under a canopy of old apple trees, and 6 months later we closed on a worn-out 40-acre dairy farm with a tilting red barn that hadn't housed animals in 20 years, a stone farmhouse that needed everything from wiring to plumbing, and a small stone carriage house at the edge of the fields that had once stored hay and carriages. That carriage house was the future restaurant. We named it Morningfield Farm Table. For the first 7 years, while we scraped together the money to build out the commercial kitchen and the dining room, I lived a life of spectacular frugality. I wore the same pair of Carhartt overalls until the knees were more patch than original denim, and I mended them by hand with a saddle stitch I learned from a book on leatherworking, because buying new ones felt like an extravagance. I drove a rusted 1987 Ford F-150 pickup that I had to start with a screwdriver jammed into the ignition cylinder after the key broke off in a sub-zero February morning, and I kept a can of starter fluid on the passenger seat because the fuel line had a tiny pinhole leak I couldn't afford to fix. Every dollar that didn't go to seed garlic, drip irrigation lines, commercial kitchen equipment, or the mortgage went into the restaurant build-out, or into the accounts I managed with a strict zero-based budget. I tracked every expense on graph paper, using a pencil because ink felt too permanent for numbers that might need adjusting. I was the quiet architect of our survival. David was the face, the storyteller, the man who would walk through the dining room with a bottle of local wine, his voice warm as summer, and make every guest feel like they had been invited to his private dinner party. But I was the one who woke at 4:30 every morning to check soil moisture sensors and the germination rate on the microgreens, who tracked every single seed packet code to guarantee variety purity, who negotiated with the feed store for bulk organic compost by the ton, who drove 3 hours to pick up a used commercial refrigerator from a closing diner, and critically, who balanced every bank statement and reconciled every credit card charge down to the penny. I did the payroll, the quarterly tax filings, the sales tax compliance, the inventory costing, and the profit and loss statements on a 14-year-old Dell desktop computer running a version of Quicken that should have been in a museum. I could tell you the exact cost of goods sold for each menu item, the margin after labor, and the break-even point for a winter Saturday night service. I knew that our braised lamb shank cost us $11.47 in raw ingredients, and with $3.50 in allocated labor per plate, we needed to sell it at $28 to clear a 15% net margin after overhead. I once found an 11-cent discrepancy in the monthly credit card settlement batch, traced it back to a double-keyed tip on a Tuesday lunch, and corrected it before the monthly close. I treated the books like a diary of the business's health, and I never let a single disconnect slip past me. That skill set, that love of order, became my sword later. David had a son from his first marriage, Mark. His biological mother had left when Mark was a toddler, and David had full custody. Mark came to live with us full-time when he was 8, shortly after we bought the farm, a skinny, dark-haired boy with his father's eyes but something watchful and withholding behind them even then. I stepped into the role of stepmother with everything I had. I didn't have children of my own, so I poured all that love into him. I helped him with his math homework at the kitchen table, where I also sorted bean seeds into envelopes, explaining fractions with the same patience I used for the farm's crop rotation schedule. I taught him to make a roux, to identify the perfect peak of a Brandywine tomato by its deep red shoulders and slight give under the thumb, to understand that a great meal starts in the ground, not on the stove. When he was 15 and wanted to take a date to the spring formal, I spent 3 weekends hemming a vintage suit I found at a thrift store, taking in the shoulders and shortening the trousers so it fit him like it was made for him. I drove him to school plays, sat through endless parent-teacher conferences, and cheered myself hoarse at his high school graduation. David and I paid for his undergraduate degree in political science, and when he got accepted to a private law school in New York City, we didn't hesitate. We took out a second mortgage on the farm, a place we had already spent a decade paying down, to cover the $80,000 tuition shortfall his scholarships didn't fill. I remember sitting in the bank's conference room, the loan officer pushing a stack of papers across the polished table, and David squeezing my hand under the table so hard my knuckles ached. He whispered, "He's our boy, Laura. This is what family does." So we signed, both of us. I never resented it, not for a second. I wanted Mark to have every opportunity. He graduated, passed the New York bar exam on his first try, and immediately hung his shingle as a solo practitioner specializing in small business law. David wept at the swearing-in ceremony, tears running down his cheeks into his beard, and when Mark took the oath, I felt a swell of pride that I can only describe as maternal. A few months later, Mark sat us down in the restaurant's back office, which by then had a professional sous vide station, a walk-in cooler I had designed myself to maintain exactly 38 degrees with minimal energy draw, and a chef's counter that seated 12. He insisted that he become the restaurant's legal counsel as a way to give back. He would handle all our contracts, our LLC operating agreement, our vendor agreements, and our estate planning. He spoke with such sincerity, such practiced gratitude, his voice breaking slightly as he said he owed everything to us. We trusted him with the legal architecture of our lives. We thought it was the safest thing in the world. The restaurant by then was a genuine success. We had been written up in regional food magazines, we had a year-long waiting list for the Saturday night chef's counter, and we employed 22 people from the local town, paying them above market wages and providing health insurance through a small business cooperative I had helped organize. David and I owned the business 50-50, which Mark himself had structured into the original limited liability company papers, with a carefully drafted operating agreement that spelled out governance, capital contributions, and dissolution terms. The building, the renovated stone carriage house, was owned by the LLC. We owed about $180,000 on the mortgage to Hudson Valley Community Bank, but the business had strong cash flow, and we were on track to pay it off within 5 years. The farmhouse and the 40 acres were held separately in the Mary Louise Trust, an irrevocable trust named after David's mother, with me as the sole beneficiary. Mark had set that up too, or so we thought. The trust was a protective fortress, designed so that no creditor could ever attach the land, and so that upon David's death, the house and fields would pass to me free and clear, outside of probate. I read the trust document at the time, a dense 50-page instrument with spendthrift provisions and a directed trustee clause, and I trusted Mark when he said it was bulletproof. Life felt like a hard-won harvest, dense and sweet, and exactly what we had worked for, the kind of harvest that makes all the early morning frosts and blistered hands worth it. Then David died. It was a Tuesday in November, cold and brittle, the kind of day where the ground is too frozen to work but not yet snow-covered, and the sky is a flat pewter that presses down on your shoulders. He had gone out to the equipment barn to move the tractor, an old Massey Ferguson that he kept running with equal parts skill and prayer. I was in the greenhouse, checking the temperature on the winter greens, a tray of mash and claytonia that I had started from seed the month before, tiny green flecks against the dark soil that still held the warmth of the propagation mat. I heard a thud, a heavy, wrong thud that didn't belong to the rhythm of the farm, and I ran. I found him collapsed on the concrete floor, his body crumpled near the tractor's rear tire, his hand still curled toward the ignition key he never turned. His eyes were open but empty, staring at a point on the wall that wasn't there. A massive coronary event, the paramedics said later, a blockage in the left anterior descending artery they call the widowmaker. Nothing could have been done. The world I knew ended in the space of one breath, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. The funeral was a blur of weeping line cooks and regular customers, holding muddy bunches of sage they had clipped from their own gardens. I moved through it in a fog so thick I could barely feel my feet, accepting hugs from people whose names I couldn't remember, nodding at platitudes about how David was in a better place. Mark and his wife Jessica arrived within hours of the death, having driven up from their home in Westchester in a silver BMW SUV that still had the temporary tags. Jessica was a high-end real estate agent with a social media feed that looked like a catalogue for a lifestyle I had never wanted, all white marble, mirrored trays of espresso, and captions about manifesting abundance in a serif font. She was tall and angular, her hair blown out into a stiff curtain, and when she hugged me her arms were rigid, her hands barely touching my back. She immediately started rearranging the living room furniture for the wake, moving David's favourite reading chair, a worn leather wingback with a depression shaped exactly like his body, out of the way as if it was a piece of clutter. I watched her do it and felt something splinter, but I said nothing. Mark was solicitous, painfully so. He kept his arm around my shoulders, his hand damp and heavy, and murmured about what a tough thing this was, how he would take care of me, how we needed to protect Dad's legacy. Even in my grief, something about the phrase, protect Dad's legacy, slid under my skin like a splinter. David's legacy was the soil and the recipes and the people, not a set of legal documents. But I let it go because my brain felt like a drowned hive of bees, all buzzing and no direction. The vultures circled the next morning. Mark and Jessica sat me down at the farmhouse table, a thick pine slab we had salvaged from a fallen tree on the property, with a leather portfolio and a stack of papers so tall it cast a shadow. Mark explained, with the oily calm of a lawyer speaking to a child who must be managed, that we had to act quickly to stabilize the restaurant. He said that there were liability concerns, that the bank might call the mortgage due if they sensed instability, that the liquor license could lapse, that the staff was panicking, and that I needed to sign a limited power of attorney so that he could manage the LLC and keep the ship sailing. He also produced a quitclaim deed that would transfer the farmhouse and the surrounding 40 acres from the Mary Louise Trust into a new trust he would control, for my own protection, he said. He said it was standard estate planning, a formality, a way to shield the property from potential creditors. Jessica nodded along, her manicured fingers tapping on the table, her nails clicking against the wood like insect legs. I stared at the papers and the letters blurred. I kept thinking of David's hands, how they would never again pick a cucumber, how the calluses he had earned from years of pruning would now just be dust. I told Mark I needed to sleep, that I couldn't process anything, and I asked him to leave the papers on the sideboard. He hesitated, a flicker of something sharp in his eyes, a tightening around the jaw that was gone in an instant, but Jessica put a hand on his arm and they retreated, murmuring about giving me time. That night, unable to rest, I walked through the house touching the door frames and inhaling the fading scent of David's sawdust and coffee. I found myself in the root cellar, a place I rarely lingered because the cold and dark felt too close like a tomb. I don't know what drew me there. Maybe it was David, reaching out, his practical ghost guiding my feet. Our farmhouse had a deep root cellar, a stone-walled room built into the side of a slope where we stored winter squash, potatoes, and my jars of pickled shallots and dilly beans. The floor was packed dirt covered with old wooden pallets to keep the crates off the damp ground. I kept my canning jars on heavy pine shelves, each jar labelled with a date and a variety in my own careful handwriting, a library of sustenance. In the far corner, behind the shelving that held the 2013 batch of bread and butter pickles, I noticed a floorboard that sat slightly higher than the others, maybe a quarter-inch, as if it had been pried up and replaced. The edges were cleaner than the surrounding boards, less worn by decades of footsteps. Desperate for any connection to David, any sign that he was still with me, I dug my fingers under the edge and lifted. The board came up easily, no nails, just gravity. Beneath it sat a small brass lockbox, heavy and tarnished, the kind with a simple keyhole and a hinged lid, the type you might use for important documents in a pre-digital age. I carried it to the kitchen table, my heart pounding with something that felt like fear and hope tangled together, a knot in my chest. I couldn't find the key, so I used a flathead screwdriver from the junk drawer to gently pry the clasp, working the tip between the lid and the body, feeling the metal protest and then yield with a soft snap. Inside was a single manila envelope, unsealed. On the front, in David's tight, block letter handwriting, all capitals, he had written, "For Laura, in case I am gone, do not open with Mark." I pulled out the papers. The first page was a letter dated 3 years earlier, the ink slightly faded but still sharp. It began with a paragraph of love that I cannot read aloud even now without crying, words about how I was the soil of his life, the steady root system that held everything together, the one who made the sun feel worth rising for. But at the bottom of the page, below his signature, he had added a postscript in red ink. I memorized every word. "Laura, I have seen things in Mark's financials that terrify me. He has been asking strange questions about the LLC structure, about what happens if I die. I overheard him on the phone once talking about a buyout and using a forged amendment. I didn't want to believe it, but I made a backup. The original partnership agreement is with Carson and Myers, file number 89-227. It proves you own 50% with full survivorship. The farmhouse and the land are in the Mary Louise Trust. You are the sole beneficiary no matter what any paper says. Do not sign anything he gives you. Do not trust him. Save yourself. I love you forever. David." The envelope also contained a small, folded note with the trust details and the law firm's contact information. Carson and Myers was a 2-person firm in Kingston, run by an elderly man named Edwin Carson, who had been David's friend since childhood, a man I had never met because David had gone to him privately, without Mark's knowledge. My husband, the man who trusted everyone, had been clear-eyed enough to see the worm in his own son and had quietly armored me against it. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, reading and rereading the words, the steam from my untouched tea curling into the cold air. The grief didn't lift, but a terrifying new clarity pushed through the fog. I was in danger, and I was now a soldier in a war I hadn't known existed. The next morning, I saw Mark loading a black trash bag into the back of his silver BMW SUV. I asked him what he was throwing away, keeping my voice light and confused. He waved a dismissive hand and said it was just some old financial junk from Dad's office, nothing I needed to worry about. Something about the way he said junk made my stomach tighten, a visceral alarm. As soon as he drove off, presumably to a meeting, I retrieved the bag from the rolling trash bin outside the kitchen door. Inside, beneath wads of ancient deposit slips and expired insurance papers dating back to the 90s, I found a small wooden cigar box, the kind a nice cigar comes in, with a sliding lid and a faint smell of cedar. Inside the box were business cards for an out-of-state bank called First Atlantic Trust, located in Delaware, a thick cream card with a Wilmington address and a phone number. There was a folded deposit ticket showing a balance of $300,000 in an account I didn't recognize, the numbers typed in a neat dot matrix font. And there was a torn piece of paper with routing numbers and an account number that started with the digits for the Cayman Islands, an international transfer code I recognized from my bookkeeping days when we once had a supplier in the Caribbean. These were not junk. These were breadcrumbs, and I followed them. I drove to the law firm of Carson and Myers that same afternoon, taking the back roads to avoid anyone seeing my truck. The office was a small clapboard house in Kingston, painted a faded blue, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle and a filing system that seemed to consist of oak bookshelves and boxes of hanging folders. Mr. Carson was in his 80s, a quiet, meticulous man with a hearing aid and a gentle smile that crinkled his eyes. He took one look at David's note, holding it carefully with fingers that had a slight tremor, and without a word he pulled the original partnership agreement from a fireproof filing cabinet that stood in the corner like a squat green sentry. The document was pristine, notarized with a raised seal, and it clearly stated that David and I each held a 50% membership interest in Morningfield Farm Table LLC, and that upon the death of one member, the surviving member automatically acquired full ownership, period. There was no provision for Mark to inherit any interest, and there was no amendment on file, and Mr. Carson confirmed that no subsequent filing had been made with the state. He told me that David had come to him 3 years ago, deeply troubled, and had asked him to hold the original as a dead man's switch. David had said, "If anything ever happens to me, Laura will need this. Mark has gotten too clever and I need a lifeboat for her." That was exactly what he had built. Mr. Carson also gave me a copy of the trust documents for the Mary Louise Trust, which confirmed I was the sole beneficiary, and that the trust was irrevocable, meaning Mark could not alter it without my consent. He warned me to be careful, saying that Mark was a lawyer and would know how to manipulate the system, how to use procedural delays and psychological pressure. I thanked him and promised to stay quiet, to play along until I had enough to destroy him. I still didn't have proof of what Mark had done or was planning, but I now knew enough to understand that every word he said was likely a trap. I needed to find the forged documents he had created after David's death, and I needed to play along to do it. Over the next week, Mark intensified his pressure campaign. He called me multiple times a day, his voice dripping with false concern, each call starting with a question about how I was sleeping, and then pivoting to the urgency of signing the power of attorney. He told me that the restaurant was hemorrhaging money without David, that the staff was panicking, that the bank was getting nervous and might accelerate the mortgage, that we could lose everything. He said it with such practiced sincerity that if I hadn't found that box, I might have believed him. He even brought a notary to the farmhouse one afternoon, a woman I didn't know, with a stamp that I would later learn was stolen from a deceased notary named Elena Shreve. They tried to corner me in the kitchen, the documents spread out on the counter like a buffet of betrayal. I played the part of a broken, foggy widow. I clutched a tissue, I spoke in a whisper, I said I was too overwhelmed and needed more time, my voice cracking at the right moments. I could see the frustration simmering behind Mark's carefully arranged face, the way his jaw clenched and his eyes flicked to Jessica. Jessica was worse in a way. She would pat my hand and say things like, "We just want to take care of you, Laura. This big old house is too much for one person. You should come stay with us in our guest house. We have a beautiful suite above the garage and you'd be near family." I recognized the offer for what it was, a gilded cage. If I stayed on the farm, I might snoop. If I was under his roof, he could monitor me and pressure me daily to sign the documents. But I made a counterintuitive decision. I agreed to move. I told them I needed to bring my garden journals, my canning supplies, and my sentimental items. In reality, I packed every bank box of financial records I could find, going back 15 years, the cardboard boxes stacked in my truck bed like a fortress of paper. I packed my desktop computer's entire hard drive, removed and wrapped in an anti-static bag, careful to ground myself on the metal case before handling it. I bought a portable flatbed scanner, a Canon model that could handle legal-sized documents, capable of 600 dpi resolution, enough to capture the microscopic details of a forged signature. And I packed that small canvas tool roll from my father, with the pick tools and tension wrenches still inside, tucked between a jar of dried lavender and a bundle of sage. No one would think twice about a woman carrying her gardening tools. I moved into their 4,000-square-foot faux colonial in Westchester, into a detached guest suite above the 3-car garage. The room was comfortable but isolated, with a separate exterior staircase that creaked in the wind, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom with generic floral wallpaper. I was allowed to come and go as I pleased, as long as I let them know if I was going to be late for the family dinner they insisted on every evening. They provided me with a small refrigerator, a microwave, and a hot plate, so I could cook my own simple meals, but Jessica always made a point of inviting me to the main house for family time. Her smile stretched tight and brittle. I would shuffle over in my slippers, wearing the same 3 cardigans on rotation, and I would make vague, slow conversation about the weather or the garden. I baked bread and made chicken pot pie from scratch for their dinners, using my own herbs and my grandmother's rolling pin, and I served it with a humble, grateful expression. They ate it with condescending gratitude, Mark sometimes patting my shoulder and saying, "It's so good to have you here, Laura. Dad would be glad we're taking care of you." They never suspected that the simple farm lady was memorizing every detail of their lives, that behind her soft, distracted smile was a forensic accountant's relentless focus. My undercover investigation began the very first week. I needed to understand the financial landscape. I knew the restaurant's accounts and our personal household accounts intimately, every recurring transfer and every seasonal pattern, but I didn't know what Mark had done after David's death. The first phase was pure reconnaissance, mapping the terrain of his fraud. I played the part of the grieving widow so effectively that they stopped seeing me as a threat. I would wander the house during the day while they were at work, ostensibly looking for a book or a cup of tea, shuffling in my worn slippers and humming tunelessly. Mark's study was on the first floor, a room with heavy oak doors that he kept locked when he wasn't home, the lock a standard quickset pin tumbler, a 5-pin lock with a shallow keyway, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. I made a mental note, cataloguing the lock type and the wear on the keyway. In the meantime, I started with public records. I used the guest Wi-Fi, a network they had set up without a password, and I would sit in my room for hours while they were out, the scanner humming beside me, searching online databases with the methodical patience of someone who has spent years reconciling subledgers. The first thing I did was pull the restaurant's business entity records from the New York Department of State's online database, a clunky portal that let you search by entity name or filing number. I searched for Morningfield Farm Table LLC. The initial filing from years ago popped up, showing David and me as the two members, with our signatures on the articles of organization. But when I checked the most recent filings, I saw an amendment to the operating agreement, dated 2 weeks after David's death, that listed Mark Davison as a new member with an 80% ownership stake, and me reduced to 20%, with a provision that he had full management authority. The amendment was signed Laura E. Davison on my behalf. My signature was there, but it was wrong. I have signed my name tens of thousands of times, on checks, on seed orders, on bank documents, so often that my hand knows the shape without my brain. I know the exact loop of the L, the upstroke of the A, the way my R hooks at the end, the slight tremor I have on the V since I broke my wrist in a fall from a ladder 20 years ago. This forgery was close, probably done by someone with a steady hand and a reference, but the L loop was too tight, compressed like a spring, and the A had a straight downstroke where mine always has a tiny curve, a vestige of the Palmer method I learned in school. I printed the document, the inkjet paper crisp, and started my evidence file, a 3-ring binder I labeled farm expenses to deflect any casual glance. Next, I searched the county clerk's online database for UCC filings against the restaurant. UCC stands for Uniform Commercial Code, and a UCC-1 financing statement is a public notice that a creditor has a security interest in a debtor's assets, essentially a lien. I had learned about these from my years of dealing with equipment leases for the restaurant's walk-in cooler and commercial range, and I knew the filing office for our county was the county clerk. Using the restaurant's employer identification number, the 9-digit tax ID I had memorized years ago, I found a UCC one that had been filed 6 weeks after David's death, listing the debtor as Morningfield Farm Table LLC and the secured party as Mark Davison. The collateral description covered all assets of the LLC, including all kitchen equipment, the liquor license, the business's accounts, inventory, and, critically, the real property and buildings, with a legal description that matched the carriage house. That was impossible. Mark was not a creditor. He had never lent the restaurant a dime. I pulled the documents attached to the filing, and there it was, a promissory note for $300,000, signed by Laura E. Davison, managing member, dated 2 days after David died. The note had terms that were predatory, a 12% interest rate and a balloon payment due in 6 months. I had never signed that note. I spread the scanned image on my screen and zoomed in to 400%, comparing the signature to my genuine one from old tax returns I had scanned. The same mismatched loops and strokes. It was a crude trace, probably done with a lightbox or a training hand, the pressure uniform and lifeless, unlike the natural variation of a live signature. I could see where the pen had been lifted and repositioned, tiny hesitations that no authentic signature would have. I printed it and added it to the binder, my heart a steady thud of something close to excitement now, the hunter's instinct waking up. I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down, deep into the soil where it could compost into resolve. I needed to trace the money. I called Hudson Valley Community Bank, the same branch where we had held our business and personal accounts for years, a small brick building with a drive-through window and a teller named Sheila who had always been kind, remembering my birthday with a card. I told her I was closing out some of David's old accounts for estate purposes and needed back statements, my voice trembling just enough. She mailed me copies of all the LLC's bank statements for the 6 months following David's death. When they arrived, I spread them out on a folding table in my guest room, a cheap plastic table I covered with a cloth to muffle sound, and began to reconstruct every single transaction. The pattern was chillingly methodical, a step-by-step dismantling of a life's work. First, Mark had deposited the $300,000 note into a newly opened account in the LLC's name at a different bank, a regional bank called Heritage Savings, with an account number I had never seen. Then, over the next week, he had transferred the entire $300,000 out of that account, in chunks of just under $10,000 each to avoid triggering automatic currency transaction reports, a technique called structuring. The money moved to an account at First Atlantic Trust in Delaware, the same bank whose business card I had found in the trash. The Delaware account was titled MD Holdings LLC, which I would later learn was a shell company Mark had created, with himself as the sole member and registered agent, using a UPS store mailing address on a commercial strip in Wilmington. From the Delaware account, I traced a wire transfer of $240,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands, held by a trust called Oceania Holdings, the sort of name that appears in offshore registries and evaporates under scrutiny. The remaining $60,000 had been spent on credit card payments, a massive bill at Neiman Marcus in Jessica's name for designer furniture and clothing, a lease payment on a new Range Rover with a VIN that matched the vehicle in their garage, and a direct transfer to Mark's personal checking account at a different bank. The restaurant's actual operating account, the one that paid our farmers, our linen service, and our staff, had been drained to a balance of $9.43 by mid-December. The staff had likely been told some story about the restaurant closing temporarily. I later learned that Mark had sent a form letter to all employees, on what looked like my letterhead but wasn't, laying them off and saying the business was insolvent. He had sold the kitchen equipment, the dining room furniture, and even the custom copper bar top to a liquidator for pennies on the dollar. That liquidator, a company called Hudson Valley Restaurant Liquidators, was another shell company he controlled, with a bank account that traced back to his personal address. I also discovered the property fraud. The Carriage House restaurant building had an original mortgage with Hudson Valley Community Bank, a loan we had been paying faithfully for years, with a balance of about $180,000. After David's death, Mark had forged a deed transferring the property from the LLC to MD Holdings LLC, with a notary stamp that I would later prove was fraudulent. He then walked into the bank, presented himself as the managing member of the new entity with a stack of forged resolutions, and refinanced the mortgage, pulling out all the equity, about $190,000. He stopped making payments immediately, so the loan was now in default, and a foreclosure notice had been published in the county newspaper's legal section, a small block of text that most people skip. I found that notice online and printed it. He had also attempted to do something similar with the farmhouse and the 40 acres, but the Mary Louise Trust was irrevocable with a spendthrift clause that prevented the beneficiary from voluntarily transferring the principal, and he couldn't break it without my signature on a quitclaim deed. That was why he was so desperate to get me to sign that paper. He needed the farmhouse, free and clear, to complete his looting, and possibly to sell it to cover his mounting debts, because I could now see from the timing of the credit card bills and the transfers that Mark and Jessica were living far beyond their means, and the restaurant fraud was meant to plug a hole that was already sinking them. I catalogued everything meticulously. I created a digital folder on an external hard drive that I kept hidden in a zippered compartment of my suitcase, organized by date and by category. Forged documents, bank statements, wire transfers, shell companies, property records. Every night after they went to bed and the house was silent except for the hum of the HVAC, I would sit at my folding table, my back aching from the chair, and scan documents at high resolution, then type up detailed notes in a password-protected file. I used a simple naming convention, YIMMDD description, PDF. I became obsessed with the trail. I traced the Cayman wire using a public database called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, which publishes certain suspicious activity report statistics, and I cross-referenced with a paywall database of offshore leaks that a journalist friend helped me access through a VPN. I couldn't get the full beneficial ownership records without a subpoena, but I could see the wire transfer records that had been flagged by the bank's automated systems, the dates and amounts matching my reconstruction. I filed a Freedom of Information Law request with the New York Department of Financial Services for any records related to MD Holdings LLC, a process that took weeks and involved filling out a form I had to mail with a self-addressed stamped envelope. Eventually, I received a package that included the articles of organization for MD Holdings, listing Mark's personal email address and his home address as the contact. That was another thread, another nail in the coffin I was building. I also began to notice Mark's behavior changing as the weeks turned into months. He would take frantic phone calls in his study at odd hours, and when he emerged, his face was flushed, his tie loosened, and he would snap at Jessica about liquidity or the auction timeline in a voice that carried down the hallway. One evening, while I was pretending to nap on the living room sofa, a crocheted afghan pulled up to my chin. Jessica took a call in the kitchen, her voice low and tense but not low enough. I heard her say, "Just close the deal before the bank files the UCC one on the equipment. We can't afford to have a public lien scare off the other buyer. The auction house needs the inventory list by Friday." I wrote down every word in a small notebook I kept in my apron pocket, using a shorthand I had developed for bookkeeping. I later learned that they were planning to sell the remaining restaurant equipment, some of which was still in storage, through a fake auction to another shell company they controlled, to hide the assets from the bank and from me, a classic bust-out scheme. I needed to get inside his study. The locked oak door was a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. I had been training my lockpicking skills in my room late at night, practicing on a practice lock I had bought from a locksmith supply website for $20, a clear acrylic lock that let you see the pins. I would sit on the edge of my bed, the tool roll spread out, and work through the familiar motions. My father's lessons came back to me with a physicality that was surprisingly fresh, the muscle memory embedding deeper each night. I practiced with a standard hook and a tension wrench, learning to apply just enough rotational pressure to bind the first pin but not so much that the plug seized. I practiced single pin picking, lifting each pin stack until the shear line aligned, feeling the subtle click through the tension wrench. I practiced raking, using a Bogota rake to jiggle multiple pins at once, and I practiced with security pins, those spool pins that give false sets and require counter-rotation. By the end of the month, I could open the practice lock in under 30 seconds blindfolded. One Tuesday, when Mark and Jessica were both out at a charity gala in the city, a black tie event I had heard them discuss with the resigned annoyance of people who attend for appearances, I waited until dark and then walked to the main house with my canvas tool roll tucked into my pocket. I used the kitchen door, which I had a key to for family dinners, a simple quickset key they had given me. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. I knelt in front of Mark's study door and examined the lock more closely. It was a standard quickset, likely with a 5-pin core, no visible anti-pick features, the keyway slightly worn from use. I selected a medium hook from my kit, a Peterson hook number 4, and a tension wrench with a slight twist that fits snugly into the bottom of the keyway. I inserted the tension wrench and applied gentle rotational pressure, as my father had taught me, just enough to feel the first binding pin resist. Then I slid the hook in and began feeling for the pins, moving from the back to the front, a technique called back-to-front picking that often gives better feedback. The first pin was already set, probably worn from the key, the second felt mushy and needed a bit more lift, the third gave a satisfying click when I raised it to the shear line, the fourth was stiff and required a careful, incremental push until it set, and the fifth set with a final click that I felt through the wrench like a tiny earthquake. The plug turned with a smooth rotation, and the door swung open. My heart was racing, but my hands were steady, the way they are when you're canning and the jar needs to seal just right. Inside, the study was a disaster of papers. Mark was not organized. He was frantic, his desk covered with stacks of files, sticky notes and half-empty coffee cups. I found a filing cabinet in the corner, a 2-drawer metal unit with a tubular lock on the top drawer, the kind used on vending machines and bicycle locks. I had a tubular lock pick in my kit, a simple tool that looks like a hollow rod with spring-loaded pins. I inserted it into the lock, applied even clockwise pressure, and then depressed each pin feeler one by one until I felt them bind. Then I increased the pressure slightly and the lock popped open with a click. Inside were folders labeled MF Holdings, Morningfield, and Personal. I pulled the Morningfield folder and found the original forged amendment to the operating agreement, the forged promissory note with its notarization, and correspondence with the liquidator including an email that said, "Make sure the bill of sale doesn't mention the LLC. We want the paper trail clean. I also found a file folder labeled Laura Trust Contest that contained draft legal pleadings to challenge the Mary Louise Trust, alleging that I was mentally incompetent and needed a guardian ad litem, and a letter from a doctor I had never met who was willing to provide an affidavit for a fee. He was planning to have me declared incapacitated and then take control of the trust. The coldness of it, the premeditated cruelty, settled into my bones like a winter frost. I scanned every document with my portable scanner, laying each page flat on the scanner bed, listening to the soft whir as it captured the image. I worked quickly but carefully, my eyes flicking to the door, my ears straining for a car engine. I returned everything to its exact place, noting the position of the folders and the angle of the papers on the desk. I relocked the filing cabinet with the tubular pick, and then I relocked the study door from the inside, stepping out, closing it, and using my picks to lock it again by applying tension in the opposite direction, a skill my father had shown me. I was back in my guest room within 45 minutes, my evidence binder now a bulging monument of crime, over 400 pages of fraud and conspiracy. I sat on my bed and allowed myself a single moment of release, a deep breath that was almost a sob, and then I got back to work. I still needed a strategy. I had proof, but I had no power. My personal savings amounted to about $22,000 from the household account I had managed to transfer before Mark froze everything, but my name was not on any of the fraudulent loans, so I had no credit of my own and no way to borrow. I was trapped in a guest house with a world-class criminal as my landlord, and I was running out of time before he would eventually force my hand or discover what I knew. I needed an ally. Mr. Carson, the elderly attorney, had been helpful, but he was retired and his practice was limited to estate planning, not criminal litigation. He put me in touch with a woman named Margaret Toller, a retired forensic accountant who lived in a small town an hour north, known for her work on complex financial crime cases. I called her from a payphone at a rest stop, a habit I had developed to avoid my phone records being monitored, and she agreed to meet me. Margaret was a wiry woman in her late 60s with sharp blue eyes that seemed to scan me like a document, a no-nonsense haircut that was more practical than stylish, and a voice that could cut through steel. She had spent 20 years at the FBI's financial crimes section, working on money laundering and fraud cases that involved shell companies in multiple jurisdictions, before retiring to a small whistleblower consultancy where she helped victims navigate the system. I met her at a diner off the interstate, the kind of place with vinyl booths that had been patched with duct tape, a jukebox that played Patsy Cline, and bottomless coffee that tasted burnt. I laid out my binder of evidence, which had grown to 520 pages by then, covering every transaction, every forged document, every shell company connection. She flipped through it silently, her expression never changing, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Then she closed the binder, looked at me over the rims and said, "You've done the hard part, Laura. You've turned a crime scene into a narrative. Now we need to make it a weapon." She agreed to help me pro bono, her outrage at the scale of the fraud and the sheer audacity of the family betrayal overriding her usual consultancy fees. From that day, Margaret became my mentor, my co-conspirator in the best sense. We met weekly at the diner or at her home office, a converted sunroom filled with filing cabinets and a massive whiteboard. She taught me to look for the forensic weaknesses that would hold up in a criminal referral. She pointed out that the notarization on the forged deed bore the stamp of a notary public named Elena Shreve. Margaret ran a quick check through the state's notary database, a subscription service she maintained, and discovered that Elena Shreve had died 2 years before the date on the stamp. That was a smoking gun, a Class E felony in New York. She also helped me trace the offshore money more thoroughly. Using her access to a subscription database for financial crimes analysts, which pulled data from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and other offshore leak sources, she tracked the Cayman Trust formation documents through a service that provided nominee directors and a registered agent. The beneficial owner forms, which we couldn't get without a subpoena yet, would later reveal Mark's personal email address as the contact, but Margaret was able to find the incorporation documents that showed the trust was funded with the exact amount of the wire transfer from the Delaware account, a direct chain. She taught me about following the money through commingled accounts, about the concept of suspicious activity report triggers, and about the way to prove intent through a pattern of structured transactions designed to avoid reporting thresholds. She showed me how to create a funds flow chart, a visual map of every transaction, with arrows and account numbers and dates that would make a prosecutor's job easy. We spent hours in her sunroom, the whiteboard filling with color-coded markers, red for forgery, blue for wire transfers, green for shell companies. I learned the language of forensic accounting in a way I had never known it, the difference between a commingled account and a structured transaction, the thresholds that trigger a suspicious activity report under the Bank Secrecy Act, the way to prove intent through a pattern of conduct rather than a single act. Margaret became my shield, the person who validated that my quiet, stubborn documentation was not just a coping mechanism but a weapon. For 5 years, I lived a double life. By day I was the sweet, slow widow who weeded her tiny vegetable patch behind the garage, a raised bed I built from scrap lumber, and made homemade ricotta from whole milk I bought at the grocery store. I would sometimes go to the local farmer's market with Jessica, carrying a basket of herbs I had grown, wearing a sun hat, and she would introduce me to her friends as David's wife. Poor dear, she's been through so much, we're taking care of her. I smiled and nodded and said very little, my voice soft and hesitant. I would bake them bread and pies, and I would listen to their conversations, storing away every scrap of financial information they inadvertently revealed. By night, I was a relentless investigator. I took a part-time remote bookkeeping job, using my farm skills to manage accounts for a small organic grocery chain that had a cooperative structure, doing their payroll, their accounts payable, their bank reconciliations, all from my laptop. I worked in the small hours, my room lit only by the screen, and I socked away every dollar into an online savings account under my LLC's name. I sold David's vintage guitar collection, one instrument at a time, through consignment shops in nearby towns, telling Mark they were replicas or that I was just decluttering. I sold a 1965 Fender Telecaster in sunburst finish for $6,000, a Gibson acoustic from the 1940s for $4,000, and a vintage Martin D28 that brought $9,000. I would wrap each guitar in a blanket, drive it to the shop, and hand it over with a story about needing to downsize. I amassed a war chest of $18,000. That number became my target because, as Margaret and I strategized, we realized there was a way to reclaim the restaurant that didn't rely on a criminal conviction happening quickly, which could take years. The promissory note that Mark had forged and the attached UCC1 lien were a piece of fraudulent debt, but they were still a lien that had been filed publicly, and in the eyes of the law, until challenged, it appeared valid. Banks and debt buyers don't always know that a debt is fraudulent when they buy portfolios of distressed loans. Margaret discovered that the original bank that had been tricked into holding the note, Heritage Savings, after realizing it was part of a fraud and marking it as a non-performing asset, had bundled it into a portfolio of similar distressed small business debts and was auctioning it off through an online platform called DebtX. This is a common practice in the world of debt buying, a lien with a face value of $300,000, but with messy, contested collateral and a fraud cloud, might sell for 5 to 10 cents on the dollar. If I could buy that note, I would step into the shoes of the lender. I would become the creditor holding the defaulted loan, and I could foreclose on the property myself. Then, at the forced sale, I could bid to buy it back, using credit bidding where I would essentially offset the debt I owned. It was a legal jiu-jitsu move, using his own fake debt as the lever to yank the restaurant out of his hands. I spent months preparing for the auction. I set up an account on the DebtX platform under a newly formed LLC that Margaret helped me create, called L&D Recovery LLC, with a registered agent address that was a post office box in a nearby town, not traceable to me. I didn't want my name anywhere near it until the moment was right. I studied the auction rules. The bidding would be open for a set period, typically a few days, and the highest bid at the close would win. I practiced bidding on a few other minor debt lots, small medical debts no one wanted, to understand the system's behavior. I learned how to read the bid tape that showed other bidders' activity in real time, a scrolling log of incremental bids, and I practiced placing bids in the final seconds to avoid driving up the price too early, a strategy called sniping. I also had to understand the concept of credit bidding, where as the secured creditor I could bid the face value of the debt rather than cash at the foreclosure sale, but for the debt purchase itself I needed real money. So I liquidated every asset I could, selling my mother's silverware set for $1,100, a collection of rare plant catalogs from the 1920s for $3,000 to a collector, and even my backup pickup truck, the old Ford, for $2,200. I scraped together $18,000 exactly, the number that felt like a talisman. The day of the auction was a Tuesday morning. I sat in my guest room with my laptop, a prepaid debit card loaded with the $18,000 that I had purchased with cash to avoid a bank trail, and a cup of chamomile tea that did nothing for my nerves. The bidding started at $5,000, the opening bid placed by an anonymous account. I placed my first bid at $8,000, then watched as other bidders, probably debt flippers who saw potential value in the property collateral, pushed it to $12,000, then $14,000. I waited until the final seconds, the clock ticking down from 30, my heart hammering so loudly I couldn't hear the birds outside. I bid $16,000 with 10 seconds left, then $17,500 with 3 seconds, then with a shaking hand, $18,000 exactly as the clock hit 2 seconds. The screen refreshed. I won. A confirmation email appeared, the subject line in bold. Bid 1 lot $2,247. I was now the legal owner of the promissory note, and the UCC won lien against MD Holdings LLC, the very document that Mark had forged to steal from me. He had no idea. He was still living in his McMansion, thinking he had pulled off the perfect crime, while I had quietly bought his weapon and turned it against him. With the debt purchased, Margaret and I moved to the final phase. We prepared a foreclosure complaint, naming MD Holdings LLC as the defendant, using a real estate attorney Margaret knew, a quiet woman named Pat who understood the strategy, and agreed to work on a contingency basis. Before filing it, I needed one last confirmation of what I already knew in my heart, that Mark was utterly devoid of any remaining humanity. The cruelty beat I engineered was not something I am proud of, but it was necessary for my own soul, to sever any lingering maternal love that might weaken me. I wanted to test his reaction to a medical crisis, to see if the boy I had raised was still in there, or if the monster had consumed him entirely. For weeks, I rehearsed the collapse, practicing the way I would fall, the way I would gasp, the way I would position my body to look lifeless but still be able to hear and see. I chose a Thursday afternoon when Jessica was at a spa appointment and Mark was home, pacing in his study. On a call I could hear through the wall about a liquidity crunch and the need to push the trust contest. I went into the main house, into the living room with its pristine cream carpet and its carefully curated coffee table books, and I staged a collapse. I knocked over a heavy side table with a porcelain lamp that shattered loudly on the hardwood floor, the sound like a gunshot, and I dropped to the floor, clutching my chest, letting out a weak, choking gasp. I lay on my back, face contorted, eyes half closed, breathing in shallow rasps, my body limp. I had a digital voice recorder app running on my phone, tucked into the front pocket of my apron, the microphone pointed out, the recording quality set to high. Mark heard the crash and came running from the study. His footsteps pounded down the hall, the rhythm urgent. He entered the living room and stopped. I expected him to scream my name, to call 911, to drop to his knees and check my pulse. Instead, there was a pause of maybe 3 seconds, a silence that felt like an ocean, and then I felt him step directly over my chest. His loafer, a brown leather tassel loafer, brushed my elbow as he lifted his foot. He did not bend down. He did not touch me. He rushed to the dining table where his briefcase was open, and I heard the rustle of papers, the snap of a latch. Then, through my half-lidded eyes, I saw him standing over me, but his focus was entirely on a manila envelope he had grabbed. He pulled out a document and scanned it, and then, into his phone, which he had apparently kept on the call, he said in a voice that was cold and relieved, a voice I had never heard from the boy I raised. The old hag finally collapsed. Call the real estate attorney and get the trust contest papers ready. We need to move on the farmhouse before the body is cold. Those words, before the body is cold, filled my ears and froze every remaining scrap of maternal love I had ever held for that boy. After about 2 minutes, when I knew I had the recording, I coughed loudly and stirred, pretending to come out of a fainting spell, my hand fluttering to my forehead. Mark ended his call, slid the phone into his pocket and walked back to me, his face instantly rearranging into a mask of concern. He said, "Oh my God, Laura, are you okay? I was just about to call an ambulance." His voice was smooth, practiced. I nodded weakly, letting him help me into a chair, my body trembling, and I said it was just a panic attack, the grief overwhelming me. His eyes were calculating, not worried. That night, alone in my room, I listened to the recording and sobbed, great heaving sobs that I muffled with my pillow, not for the ghost of my stepson, but for the release of finally knowing without any doubt that I was dealing with a monster and that I would not hesitate. A week later, Margaret and I filed the foreclosure action with the county clerk, and the process server, a man in a windbreaker that said process server in reflective letters, caught Mark at his golf club in front of his business associates and handed him the complaint. The look on his face, according to the server who later told Margaret with a chuckle, was one of pure disbelief, a mix of confusion and dawning horror. The same day, I also sent my now 520-page forensic report, with Margaret's expert attestation and a cover letter summarizing the fraud, to the New York State Bar Association's Attorney Grievance Committee and to the District Attorney's Office via certified mail and encrypted email. I included the audio file of the Hague remark, a transcript with timestamps, the evidence of the forged notary stamp, the UCC-1 filing, the shell companies, and everything else. The State Bar acted with surprising swiftness. Within a month, they issued an interim suspension of Mark's law license pending formal disciplinary charges, meaning he could no longer practice law or represent himself in any meaningful way. The DA opened a criminal investigation and executed search warrants on Mark's house and office, seizing computers, filing cabinets, and bank records. They found the original forged documents that I had seen in his filing cabinet, plus additional evidence on his computer, including drafts of the trust contest pleading and emails with the co-conspirator doctor. The forensic avalanche was now in motion, and I was safely out of the guest house, having moved back to the farmhouse under an emergency protective order that Margaret's colleague helped me obtain on the basis of the recording and the threat it implied. The final confrontation was not cinematic, it was procedural, which is how I prefer my justice. Mark, desperate and unhinged, his law license suspended and his assets frozen, still didn't know I had bought the restaurant debt. He thought he could still salvage something by forcing me to sign the trust documents. He showed up at the farmhouse one morning, banging on the door with both fists, his face red and unshaven. He demanded I come with him to the bank to sign documents to unfreeze the Mary Louise Trust so he could pay legal bills to fight the disciplinary action. I agreed calmly, my heart steady. I put on my old wool coat, the same one I had worn on 100 cold mornings, and rode in his car, a rental since his Range Rover had been seized. At the bank, the same branch of Hudson Valley Community Bank that had held our original mortgage, we sat in a small office with a trust officer named Mr. Peralta, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses and a careful manner. Mark handed me a pen and a document authorizing a $150,000 withdrawal from the trust's liquid assets, a document he had drafted himself, with a signature line for the beneficiary. I looked at the paper, and I laid the pen down. I looked him in the eye for the first time in years without any disguise, without the foggy widow, and I said, I will not sign this. I am not required to, and I am acting under the advice of counsel. The Mary Louise Trust is irrevocable, and I am the sole beneficiary. You have no power over it, Mark. His face contorted into a mask of rage, the veins on his forehead bulging. He started to shout, calling me a senile old fool, a scheming gold digger, telling me I would be out on the street, that he would have me committed. Mr. Peralta pressed a silent alarm under his desk, a button I saw him press with his knee. 2 bank security guards appeared, large men in navy blazers. Mark, in his fury, lunged toward me and the guards restrained him, one on each arm, as he screamed obscenities. The police arrived within minutes, and he was arrested on a violation of the protective order and later charged with attempted grand larceny. I simply stood up, walked out of the bank into the cold November air, and drove home to my farm. The DA's forensic accountant duplicated my trail and added their own subpoena power, obtaining the full Cayman records and the bank records from Delaware. They uncovered the full scope: the fake liquidator, the forged notary stamp, the shell companies, the structured transfers, and the commingled funds. Mark was arrested in his own driveway on a grand jury indictment that included 2 counts of grand larceny in the second degree, 3 counts of forgery in the first degree, and 1 count of criminal possession of a forged instrument. The State Bar disbarred him after a disciplinary hearing where he tried to represent himself and made a fool out of everyone, including the 5-member panel, who listened in stony silence as he rambled about conspiracies. As part of a plea agreement that Margaret advised the DA to accept to avoid a lengthy trial for me, he eventually pleaded guilty to 1 count of grand larceny and served 14 months in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He was ordered to pay restitution of $300,000, but most of his assets were already seized, including the Westchester house, which was foreclosed by the bank, the cars, and the remaining contents of the Cayman account, which after legal fees and the offshore bank's own charges, amounted to only about $90,000. Jessica divorced him before the trial even concluded, moving to Florida with a new real estate license and a story about how she had been deceived too, though I doubt that very much. Mark would spend the rest of his life burdened by that unpaid judgment, his credit destroyed, his reputation a smoking crater, unable to ever work in law or finance again. Meanwhile, the foreclosure on the restaurant building proceeded on a parallel track. Since I was the note holder and lien holder through L&D Recovery LLC, I filed a motion for a judgment of foreclosure, and the court granted it after a brief hearing where no one objected because MD Holdings LLC had no counsel and Mark was incarcerated. The building was set for a sheriff's sale. On a grey November morning, 5 years to the month after David died, I stood on the courthouse steps with Margaret and Pat, the real estate attorney. The sheriff's auction was held on the front steps, a portable podium set up, a small crowd of maybe 10 people, mostly curiosity seekers and a few bargain hunters. I had prepared for the possibility of other bidders, but the title was so clouded by the fraud allegations, the pending criminal case, and the complexity of the chain of title that no serious investor wanted to touch it. The auctioneer, a man in a cowboy hat who seemed to enjoy his job, called for opening bids. I bid $1,000, a nominal credit against the debt I already owned, using credit bidding as the secured creditor. No one else bid. The auctioneer banged his gavel 3 times, each bang a small thunderclap of justice, and declared the property sold to L&D Recovery LLC. The building reverted to me, free and clear of Mark's fraudulent liens. I also moved in court to vacate the forged deed, and the judge ordered the county clerk to expunge it from the record, restoring the original unbroken chain of title to the Laura E. Davison Revocable Trust, which I had set up with Pat's help in the meantime to receive the property. I owned the restaurant again, the physical space where I had built a life with David. The $90,000 in restitution, which came from the seized assets and was paid to me as a victim under the plea agreement, was a gift from the universe, a fraction of what was stolen but enough to start. I used every penny to renovate and reopen. I renamed the restaurant David's Table, a simple name that said everything. I rehired 3 of the original line cooks who had scattered to other jobs after the layoffs, tracking down one in a diner upstate and another in a catering company in the city. I found a young chef, a woman named Celia, who had studied at a culinary institute but was disillusioned with the industrial food system and wanted to return to soil-to-plate cooking. I swept the stone floors myself, the broom scratching against the grout, and I polished the copper bar top that a local craftsman had remade from salvaged copper sheets. I replanted the kitchen garden with the same heirloom seeds I had saved for 5 years in a cool, dark drawer, brandywine tomatoes, lemon cucumbers, and a variety of basil that David had loved. I took a hammer to the old sign that said Morningfield, the wood splintering under my blows, and hung a new one, hand-painted by a friend, that said David's Table in green letters against a cream background. The first spring, when the brandywine tomatoes came in heavy and perfect, their skins warm from the sun, I sliced one, sprinkled it with flake salt and a torn basil leaf from the garden, and ate it standing in the empty dining room, the light pouring through the windows David had chosen. The juice ran down my chin, and I cried not from grief, but from the overwhelming sense that the farm, the soil, the life we had built, was alive again. I think about David's brass lockbox often. It sits on a shelf in my office now, next to the original partnership agreement in a simple wooden frame. He was a big, laughing man who didn't seem like the type to build a dead man's switch, but he did, and he did it because he knew me. He knew I was the one who tracked the fractions, who reconciled the ledgers, who could gently pull on a thread until an entire tapestry of lies unraveled. His final gift to me wasn't just the warning. It was the certainty that I had the skills to walk through the fire and come out the other side. The farm taught me that soil can be poisoned and then healed, that patience is not passive but active, awaiting with roots deep enough to find water even in a drought, and that the best harvest, the sweetest, most nourishing harvest, comes from seeds planted years before by people who believed in something bigger than themselves. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you believe that justice can be served with a spreadsheet, a thorough audit trail, and a quiet refusal to be erased, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of ordinary people who turned the tables on the people who underestimated them. Thank you for watching.